Is Mrs. Reddy nice to work for?
Oh, Reddy's all right. But there's only one Miss Jacqueline.
Mrs. Reddy seems rather an odd woman to me.
She's really a pretty good sort.
What does she do with herself after business hours? It's always seemed to me that she was sort of lonely and unhappy.
Well, Mary, I guess most people are.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
So, we're getting into the third film that we're doing as part of our review of Val Lewton's filmography, although this is the fourth film overall that he created. So we're going to be covering the seventh victim for today's episode. This is kind of a personal favorite of mine, which isn't really a novel take. I think a lot of people are fans of the seventh victim in particular among his films. It's his most personal. It's kind of his most different in regards to the kinds of films that are being made in Hollywood at the time in terms of, like, its relationship to the horror genre in particular. This is kind of like with The Leopard Man, where it's really not even so much a horror movie. Pretty much the only way it really qualifies in the horror film genre is that it basically involves a satanic cult, so I guess semantically...
Well, it's like a psychological thriller.
Right,
right?
Yeah, it's definitely towards the...
parapsychological thriller,
yeah,
right?
Parapsychological, because that's the other thing is that, like, you know, just like with The Leopard Man, there's not the same degree of, like, there's not a supernatural element in the sense of that's what's blurring the line between what the character perceives and what is real or what the mind is making real. And it isn't really until the very climax of the movie that you get this kind of sequence where it's really not very obvious, but I think that in that final sequence of the film where the protagonist, well, not the protagonist, but the titular seventh victim is doing this long walk home at night in the dark. It's not quite obvious, but I think we're supposed to assume that this is possibly an instance of the imagination producing things that aren't necessarily there, and I think that's a question that's interesting to deal with. But just a little bit of background as we're getting into this. So immediately after Cat People was a success, Lewton got a provision added to his contract in which he was going, after his third picture, which would have been The Leopard Man, he was going to be allowed to direct an A picture. Now, with a title like The Seventh Victim, considering that, you know, let's say the studio brass at RKO hadn't been very happy that Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie and The Leopard Man had turned out the way they did. Because if you're in the front office or the publicity office of a major studio and you're telling your producer that, okay, you're going to make a movie called Cat People, you're not expecting a movie in which it's not explicit that the character in the movie doesn't turn into like a cat monster or something. Right. It's the same thing with I Walked with a Zombie. It's the same thing with The Leopard Man. With a title like The Seventh Victim, though, it's coming in the same way. The publicity office is just coming up with a kind of title and saying, all right, make a horror film out of this, make it less than 75 minutes, make it for less than $150,000. With a title like The Seventh Victim, it's a lot less lurid and a lot less specific than the previous titles he was given. So there's the possibility here that at the very least, the executives at RKO are like, all right, let's try to meet this guy halfway. Let's give him something that's a little more evocative, and maybe that way there'll be better communication between both ends of this thing. But at the same time, RKO is also doing a lot of things that are kind of putting Lewton in a tight spot as far as like as far as whether he's actually going to be able to capitalize on the greater degree of creative control and the greater opportunity he's being given. So for one, he's being separated from his collaborator, Jacques Tourneur, who was the editor on Cat People, the director on Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, and The Leopard Man, RKO's planning on cultivating Turnier for his own career in A prestige pictures, and Lewton is kind of not being recognized in the same way, because the fact is that once Lewton has already completed 3 pictures with The Leopard Man, you know, he's had this provision since the success of Cat People that he can do an option for an A picture after that. But the fact is that they're basically, after Cat People, he already has I Walked with a Zombie about to be premiered, and The Leopard Man is already in post-production. So despite the fact that in his contract he technically has the option for an A picture, suddenly they're giving him the 7th victim, and so you might get the impression that they're kind of surreptitiously attempting to keep him busy in order to avoid fulfilling their contractual obligations. Finally, there's this issue, which is that despite the fact that Lewton was previously, you know, very big at the studio because of how well Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie was, not very big, but he, you know, he was getting notices. It's like, man, he really turned around these films very quickly for very little, and they made a lot of money, and for better or worse, they didn't get terrible reviews either. But then there's also a guy at the studio who's kind of taking some shine off of Lewton. He's another B director named Edward Demetric. Now, of course, Edward Demetric previously directed The Devil Commands for Columbia, but he's also had a very successful B movie at RKO called Hitler's Children, which was released in January 6 of 1943, very shortly after Cat People premiered. And so Hitler's Children is more successful than Cat People is, so in the eyes of the studio brass, suddenly everybody is talking about this Demetric guy who seems to be a little bit more manageable than Lewton is. And so now Lewton is in this position where he's like, okay, I want to make an A picture, but I'm now locked into these back-to-back productions. I'm having to rotate through my screenwriters to try to get these overlapping projects done. And it seems like the studio is basically trying to, by sort of suggestion rather than force, compel him to make these movies in a more assembly line manner than he wants to be doing. So DeWitt Bodine, who wrote the screenplay for Cat People, he's the first one who gets a crack at the 7th victim, but Lewton is kind of dissatisfied with his original story, and so Bodine, who is already doing research in Tarrytown, New York for Curse of the Cat People, the sequel to Cat People, Lewton decides that he's going to partner him up with a guy named Charles O'Neill to work out the screenplay for the movie. So when I Walked with a Zombie proves to be a box office success very soon after its premiere, finally Lewton gets called into Charles Kerner and RKO's, and with a meeting with Charles Kerner and the other executives at RKO, and they basically tell him, okay, we're going to reclassify the 7th victim, which is still in development. They still don't have a finished screenplay. They're like, we're going to reclassify this as an A picture. We're going to give you a bigger budget. You don't have the same time constrictions. You can basically, you know, as long as you don't do anything that's going to get the production code censors upset and that we think is bankable, you have the same creative license that you did with everything else. And so he's like, okay, wing go. But now he doesn't have tenure. And he's really obsessed with not only making sure that he has someone in his field who he has a good working professional relationship with, but also somebody that he can control better than some director that the studio is just going to assign to him. And so he taps Mark Robeson, who was previously the editor on all 3 of his previous films, to direct The 7th Victim. Now, Mark Robeson has never directed a movie before, and now Lewton is saying, well, for my first A picture, I want this guy to direct. RKO is like, no, you have an option here. You can either make an A picture, or you can make another B picture with Mark Robeson as director. You can't make both. And so Lewton makes the decision that he's going to stick with Robeson and elevate him rather than make the A picture that he really wants to make. So as a consequence of that, The Seventh Victim goes into production with a screenplay that is obviously too long for the time constraints that they have. So by the time it is eventually released, there are 4 key scenes in the film that are cut out of it, and that Lewton would later maintain destroyed the continuity and like the logic of the movie, that it kind of inhibited the film and made it, you know, and that's the thing though, is that like even in its abbreviated form, the movie is already fairly complicated and convoluted, but it seems like there's a sort of consensus that whatever was cut out of the film contributed greatly to what was ultimately a lot of confusion when it came to the plot of the film, of what precisely is supposed to be going on, what the motivations of the characters are supposed to be. But I was surprised when watching the film, you seem to not really have any confusion about these things. And I want you to kind of like...
No, I don't. I didn't. When I told you about this years ago, when I saw it on Turner Classic Movie, I just cut into it. And I looked at it for a while, and I was gravitated to it. And I finished it, but I never saw the beginning. But even then, it was a captivating film. And I followed what was there, you know, for the part that I saw. And it was great to see it again from its entirety, from the beginning to the end. It was really, I think it's a great film. It's, you know, it shows the conditions of being... I don't think the editing was really the problem, nor was the cutting out of the scenes. There's something about the actors that doesn't quite gel as well. And so we can get into it. We can get into it.
Definitely.
Obviously, the script isn't as tight as the I Walk with a Zombie.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I hate to tell you, there aren't many pictures that really can stand up to Walk with a Zombie, but I hate to tell you, talk about the Cat People. The Cat People is a lot better than a remake with Natasha Kinski. I mean, I hate to say it, that was an embarrassment walking out of that theater. I didn't know what was up with that.
You know, I've finally been talking to Eli about the possibility of us recording 2 episodes, one on the Cat People and one on Paul Schrader's remake of Cat People. And he's only seen Paul Schrader's remake, and he's a big fan of it. And so from his perspective, it's interesting because I think I haven't seen Paul Schrader's remake, but having seen enough trailers and clips from it and kind of knowing it by infamy, my expectation is that Paul Schrader doesn't quite capture the kind of existential dread that Lewton
it's a bad horror film
that is motivating Lewton. Whereas from Eli's perspective, having not seen Cat People, and I don't think he's seen any Lewton films, from his perspective, I think he finds it hard to believe that Lewton's film is as impactful at a psychosexual level, that there's that same degree of kind of perverseness that can really come to the surface at a time where like there's so much censorship. But even just mentioning Cat People, it seems like
we have to keep coming back to that, right?
More than any of his films, it seems like Cat People and Seventh Victim are really part of a
essential,
kind.
Right? Yeah, they really are. Yeah,
I mean, there are certain motifs that keep and themes that keep coming up in Lewton's films, and I think one of the most important is. At least one of the most important is in the context of, number one, in the context of horror, is his consistently going against the grain that was going on at Universal, where, you know, George Wagner at Universal, he was very much convinced that horror movies should take place in kind of a fairy tale, never land sort of setting, a place that doesn't really which we saw very much when we were going through like the sort of continuity like jungle of the Wolfman and Frankenstein movies, how like eventually they reach a point where it's literally impossible to discern when these movies are supposed to be taking place. Right. The geographical continuity is all over the place. All you can do is kind of shrug your shoulders and say, it's just fairy tale land.
Let's go with it.
Don't pay attention. Just go with it. Lewton's films are very different. His settings that he chooses are very contemporary and very specifically modern. Even in a case like I Walked with a Zombie or The Leopard Man, there is always this sort of, even I Walked with a Zombie is at about as close as you get to this in these early films of his to this kind of fairy tale sort of world. But even in that context, he does something that's different than the Universal films, which is that he starts out in a contemporary setting in order to, so this fairy tale world, it like sort of achieves this larger in life quality in contrast to something that's more familiar and more grounded. Whereas with something like The Cat People or The Seventh Victim, you can definitely see the sort of prototypical influence of Lewton's films and their sort of prescience and sort of predicting the modern noir film, where you're going to increasingly see, not in terms of content, but in terms of themes, the blurring of the lines between between the thriller film and a more psychological sort of crime story that is more concerned with the pathology of the participants within it, the sort of and of course the alienation of urban life.
Right, like even Alfred Hitchcock copies this over and over again, even like in Vertigo or something. There really is that thin line,
between what the characters perceive and what is real.
And they capitalized on it, but it's a great. This is a remarkable film. There's so many themes that are in it. There's also I wish they would have developed the Francis Fallon character and the Gene Brooks character. We'll get into the actual plot in a little bit, but there's little elements of everything in this film. So and the choice between life and death. Unlike I Walk with a Zombie, we talked about this, that each scene is a very tight vignette that flows into the next one, and in many ways is individual in itself. It's as if actors came on the set, did their thing, and they walked away. And if I had an evening of that, I'd be thrilled. Right. And this does pretty much the same thing. There are little capsules of things that go on here that, firstly, that end scene where, the woman talks about, I'm not going to die anymore. I'm going to go live. And if I drop dead, fine. And the Gene Brooks character says, well, I've been looking to die all the time.
Right.
It's really a poignant contrapuntal, although,
and very much similar to The Leopard Man in terms of the attempt to accentuate themes by showing this sort of intersection of the fates of two different characters.
Right, exactly.
Except in this, I think it's more successful than The Leopard Man, because The Leopard Man, it shows the intersection of stories between characters who are all sort of tragically doomed to die. Where here in the climax of the seventh victim, it's more interesting because it's showing the intersection of these two atomized, alienated lives in this incredibly atomizing and alienating environment. And it shows the possibility of these two people crossing in the night and sort of unwittingly not knowing that they're both informing upon each other's decisions as to whether their fate is one where they just have to accept this kind of ultimate end of everything, or if their fate is, no, there's more to life, there's more than just this incredible gravity and weight, that there's a purpose to it.
And which is very interesting, the room that and we'll talk about the plot. It's not giving anything away, but the room is room 7, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, the seventh victim. Yeah. So it's got.
And the 7, what is?
And it's interesting because 7 is in numerological terms tends to be a lucky number.
Right.
So are we supposed to take
the 7 sins?
So yeah. So or the seven deadly sins. That's another one. But that's the layering of meaning. So is this like basically the ultimate sort of puritanical punishment for this character who we've slowly learned is kind of like lost morally as well as existentially? Or is this 7 actually representing, no, this is the good ending, this is the character who is actually liberated, everybody else is doomed to this fog and this void where they're never sure of what's going to happen? I think the other most important thing to mention in terms of the pattern of Lewton's film, before we get into the plot, is his consistent centralization of intelligent, resourceful women characters at a time when not just the horror film, but American films in general were increasingly becoming more chauvinistic and less open to the possibilities of a three-dimensional depiction of women. It really is, and I think it's interesting because if Lewton has an obsession with fatalism and with the idea of death being its own release, which is another thing that unites Cat People and Seventh Victim. You know, if I had to tell Eli anything, but I don't want to because I don't want to give away the film, the thing about Cat People that is probably going to make it the most different from Schrader's film is that while there's a psychosexual element to Cat People, that's not really what the story is about. Fundamentally, Cat People is the story about a alienated, neurotic woman who longs for a way out and thinks that death is the only solution. And I think The Seventh Victim continues that theme and heightens it to such a sort of oppressive degree that you really have to wonder, you know, is considering it as part of a pattern of Lewton's films that are so obsessed with fate and so obsessed with the finality of death and so obsessed with, as we saw with I Walked with a Zombie too, this almost romantic depiction of taking one's own life in order to liberate oneself or to protect other people. You really have to wonder why it is what it is in his personal background that is manifesting the particular animation of these ideas through women. Why doesn't he choose male characters? Why does he focus on women? Is it because he's more attentive to the kind of like the disproportionate effect that such an alienating society is going to have on women? Or is it just his background, the fact that he was raised by a single mother, that his aunt was a very successful actress who was very defiant and very self-possessed, is it that? Or is there just something about Lewton's own kind of closeted feminine qualities that are kind of coming out in his movie as a way of maybe living through these characters as opposed to just, like other horror movies, just using women as proxies to visit violence upon?
I guess I don't know if that's the case, but I don't think it's any of those. I think it's the fact that women are more in tune to their environment. By virtue of the fact that they weren't given more parts isn't the point. The point is that it doesn't matter. I mean, women are just more in tune to things. And for some reason, it's more believable if a woman portrays a character that goes through these kinds of transformations. Whereas a male, if anything, there's set pieces that just work with the women. They really don't have any, they're more of a, you're an interlocutor or some kind of, something that moves the plot along.
Right.
And we've seen this before, though, like in the Mysteries of the Rue Morgue, whatever that was, where the woman...
Mystery of the Wax Museum?
Mystery of the Wax, where she was the reporter, right?
Right.
When have we seen a film was that more recent than this or
No,
later?
that was the 30s. That was the first golden
there we
age.
go.
That was way back in 32.
So someone had the idea, let's put a woman in, so it's not an unusual...
That was the thing. It was unusual back then, and it still is to a certain extent. But like, I think in the case of the 30s, and that was very specific. I remember when we were going over these golden age horror movies, one of the things that I wanted to stress with Mystery of the Wax Museum is that this is the sort of movie that could have only been made at Warner Brothers, because Warner Brothers was at the time kind of like the populist studio. They were the ones that made more movies dealing with hard scrabble working class characters than anybody, which by extension, by accident, if not by deliberation, meant that they inevitably made more types of movies that focused on women, that depicted women as being able to be just as hard scrabble, just as resourceful, just as intelligent as men could be. But there is something that definitely happened with, number one, with the clamping down of the Production Code Administration. And number two, I think definitely with the build up to the Second World War and the aftermath of it, you do start to see the supplication of women in American popular culture, I think, in a sort of very organic and direct response to the kind of threat that kind of feminine independence poses in a fundamentally patriarchal society.
Yeah.
And
no
so
doubt.
I wonder if there's an extent to which, whether Lewton's aware of it or not, whether he sort of intuits that female characters are better for exploring these sorts of things because there's something about being an oppressed member of a society, whether you're a woman, whether you're not a white person, whether you're a queer person or a homosexual. And just like in Cat People, there are allusions to like sort of queerness in The Seventh Victim that are never explicitly stated.
Right.
And that goes to the relationship between Jean Brooks's character and the Francis character, the hairdresser.
Well, it's not really brought out. But yes,
right,
so
but
you're
there's
so
there's
kind to me.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's something going on. It's like you're so kind to the hairdresser who works for you,
Yeah.
but also like the passion she has for her. Like and also it's like another woman at the social party says, "Oh yes, we were very intimate with each other a long time back." You're like, okay, they're alluding to something here, but there's something to be said about the idea that being a member of an oppressed group makes you a better character to explore certain themes, because being in an oppressed group kind of forces you to be more perceptive about things, if merely by virtue of the fact that you need to be able to navigate that oppressive society more strictly than a socialized male has to.
I mean, I have. If you've read any of my scripts, I mean, my scripts have a lot of female characters that are protagonists or have a major part in, even though it's a bad script. But it doesn't matter. But the point is that I get the gist of it. For some reason, I can't see a male in that role. Maybe that's a kind of a counter. I don't know what you would call it.
Well, I think part of it is, and maybe like we're just overthinking it. Maybe
part of
it is just the creative instinct of realizing that something is more interesting because we've seen this done. We've seen certain experiences done through men a million times before. Maybe just seeing a woman in that role not only is more inherently interesting, but even for male spectators, it can allow a different entertaining and a different
gets them off the hook. They can take a step back and look at a different interpretation.
Right, exactly. Get a different experience that allows them to say, "Oh, there's something else that I can recognize, and that makes me feel included. That isn't as alienating as typical male performances are."
Right.
But yeah, I think there's something to be said about that. And it's like, but do you want to just go ahead and jump into the synopsis, because we've got a pretty complicated plot to get through?
I don't think it's that complicated. But go ahead.
Well, let's get into it. At a prestigious boarding school somewhere in upstate New York, a young woman named Mary Gibson, Kim Hunter, later Stella in the film version of A Streetcar Named Desire, although she's much younger here. This is 1943. Streetcar Named Desire was 1951. Mary Gibson is informed that her tuition hasn't been paid in 6 months, and that the school has been unable to get into contact with her benefactor, her older sister Jacqueline. As a result, she cannot remain enrolled at the school. The headmistress offers Mary a job working with the younger children at the school, but she decides she must venture first into New York City to discover what happened to her sister. Before she leaves, the headmistress's assistant warns her against coming back to the school under any circumstances. "One must have courage to really live in the world," she says morbidly before the incessant headmistress beckons her back into her office. Mary first goes to La Sagesse, a cosmetics factory and beauty company that Jacqueline owns, only to discover from the plant's manager, a cold and indifferent woman named Esther Reddy, played by Mary Newton, that Jacqueline sold the business to her 8 months ago. Luckily, an old friend of Mary's, Frances Fallon, played by Isabel Jewell — you'll recognize Jewell as Maria the fortune teller from The Leopard Man.
Right.
A lot of actors from Lewton's
In
staple
tell you the truth, I didn't
keep coming up in
recognize
his
her.
movie. Yeah.
I did not recognize her as being
She's
that,
very different in this role.
Yeah.
Frances tells Mary that she actually saw Jacqueline less than a week ago at an Italian bed and breakfast called the Dante. But as you might imagine, an establishment called the Dante proves to just be another Crossroads. Mary learns that Jacqueline arrived at the Dante months ago, being chauffeured in a car accompanied by a very handsome man, and rented a room in which she never stayed. When Mary is allowed access to the room, she and the innkeepers are aghast to find it empty, save for a chair and a hanging noose. Mary then goes to the Missing Persons Bureau, where she meets a private investigator named Irving August, Lou Lubin. He offers to help her, but Mary is unable to pay. She does get a tip to check the hospitals and the city morgues for her sister, and as she leaves, Irving is taken aside by an imposing-looking man who warns him to keep his nose out of the case. Mary goes to the morgue and discovers that another person is looking for Jacqueline, a personal attorney named Gregory Ward, played by Hugh Beaumont, who would go on to become Ward Cleaver in Leave It to Beaver.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Going to his office, she learns that Gregory had fallen in love with Jacqueline. She also learns more about the noose. According to Ward, Jacqueline had, quote, a feeling about life, that it wasn't worth living unless one could end it. Ward seems strangely optimistic that Jacqueline would never commit suicide, though he readily admits that she lives in a world of her own fancy, and that, even more cryptically, she doesn't always tell the truth because she doesn't know what the truth is. Mary returns to her hotel, where she finds Irving August waiting. Having taken a personal interest in the case, August reveals that he's discovered that Reddy lied. Jacqueline didn't sell her the business, she outright deeded it to her as a gift. Disguising himself as a health inspector, August then went to La Sagesse and began searching through the rooms, only to find one room in which he was unable to gain access. Determined to track down any leads on her sister, Mary insists upon going down to La Sagesse, sneaking in and gaining access to the locked room. Avoiding the night watchman and breaking into La Sagesse, Mary finds herself too afraid to go to the end of the dark hallway where the room is, forcing August to go on his own. When he emerges from the room, August collapses dead from a stab wound to the belly. Fleeing the scene, Mary rides the subway back and forth, unsure of what to do, only to return to the stop near La Sagesse on 14th Street, where a trio of drunkards board, two of them carrying a passed-out member in between them. As they sit together and the hat of the middle one slips away, Mary realizes that they are actually carrying August's dead body. She tries to inform a conductor, but when they return to the car, the men have disappeared. Calling upon Ward, he dissuades her from going to the police to report what she saw, instead encouraging her to try to get on with her life rather than obsess over what happened to Jacqueline. With his help, she gets a job teaching children in a local kindergarten and moves out of her hotel room into the Dante, holding out hope that she'll encounter Jacqueline this way. Some indefinite amount of time later, Ward receives a visit at his office from a psychiatrist named Dr. Lewis Judd, played by Tom Conway. Now, Conway, of course, played Paul Holland in I Walked with a Zombie, though, quite interestingly, also played a psychiatrist named Dr. Lewis Judd in Val Lewton's first film, Cat People. Of course, Dr. Lewis Judd died at the end of Cat People, so unless The Seventh Victim is supposed to be an unofficial prequel to Cat People, I think we can safely assume that this is not supposed to be the same Dr. Lewis Judd. Although it is fun thinking about The Seventh Victim as a prequel to Cat People. At any rate, it turns out that Judd has been taking care of Jacqueline and has come to Ward with a request for money, because taking care of her all this time has placed a financial burden on him. Ward reluctantly gives Judd all he can spare at the moment. And,
$45.
Yeah, $45. He wants $100, but he only has $45 in his wallet. And from there, Judd then goes to the kindergarten where Mary teaches, surprising her by telling her he's come to take her to see Jacqueline. Judd takes Mary to a swanky hotel, the type of place where you might keep a mistress rather than a patient, only to discover Jacqueline isn't there at all. All at once, Judd's suave and confident demeanor melts away. "She's left me to meet them alone," he says cryptically, and he suddenly leaves Mary. Moments later, there's a knock on the door, and Mary opens it to reveal Jacqueline, played by Jean Brooks. We'll recognize Brooks as having played Kiki Walker in The Leopard Man. Jacqueline says nothing, looking over her shoulder as if she perceives someone might be following or listening to them. She puts her fingers up to her lips to keep Mary quiet, and without so much as a word, closes the door again and vanishes. If this weren't enough, soon after this, Mary is accosted in Jacqueline's room by two rough-looking men, including the one who tried to bully Irving August off the case in the first place. They grill Mary for information about Jacqueline, revealing themselves to be private investigators hired by Jacqueline's heretofore unknown husband, Gregory Ward. That night at the Dante, Ward and Mary sit down to dinner, and Ward tries to explain why he hasn't revealed the truth about his and Jacqueline's relationship. In the meantime, a poet who boards at the Dante, Jason Hogue, played by Urford Gage, that's quite a name, insists that he's going to help Mary find her sister. That very night, Jason takes Ward and Mary to a step-down apartment in Greenwich Village, where a group mostly composed of wealthy socialites hold a private party. Among them is none other than Louis Judd himself, who Jason confronts about Jacqueline's whereabouts. We learn that Jason's motivations are pretty personal. There was another woman some years ago who he had fallen in love with, who was also a patient of Dr. Judd's, and who also disappeared without a trace. Judd, in turn, reveals that Jason hasn't published any work in 10 years, insinuating that he's just desperate to find a purpose. Which is all to say that going to the party doesn't really give Mary much new information or closure, except that many of those in attendance were once intimate friends of her sister. Still, she respects Jason's honesty and entrusts him to look for Jacqueline. Jason takes his impromptu investigation to the local library, where he uses some surprisingly effective flattery on the librarian to gain access to the checkout records of two of Jacqueline's closest associates, Esther Reddy and Paul Judd. Jason learns that both Reddy and Judd have a similar interest in esoteric books, the kind that you can't get except in the adult section of the library, back when they used to have restricted adult sections where they kept all the good stuff and regular children couldn't gain access to them. Not pornography or anything.
No.
I'm talking about like stuff
Right.
that back in those days they considered to be like ungodly or like not appropriate for
Right.
like that you couldn't
Tropic of Cancer.
Tropic of Cancer. Yeah, stuff you can't put on the regular bookshelf, on the regular stacks, yeah. In particular, he discovers in one of the books a tracing that only Reddy could have made of a symbol in the book depicting a parallelogram with a split triangle in the center. This turns out to be a symbol of the Pilatus, a cult of theistic Satanists. What's more, when Mary makes an appointment with Francis in order to inquire about Jacqueline, she discovers that the symbol of the Pilatus is being used as Mrs. Reddy's new trademark for La Sagesse's products. Later that night, as Mary showers, she receives a visit from Ms. Reddy herself, who warns her to stop looking for Jacqueline, claiming that it was Jacqueline herself who stabbed Irving August and that it was the Pilatus intern who covered it up. Ms. Reddy then returns to the apartment where the socialites, revealed as the Pilatus cult, have gathered. It is revealed that Jacqueline was a part of the group, but fell into ill favor with them once she revealed to her psychiatrist, Dr. Judd, some of the secrets of their organization, a transgression which is itself punishable by death. Now that she has killed August, the investigation of which would inevitably implicate the cult and its members, they are more determined than ever to see Jacqueline disposed of. Mary goes to Jason, telling him what she learned from Ms. Reddy, and in distress, confessing she has fallen in love with Ward. They call Ward over, and once he learns about what Jacqueline did, decides that the only recourse is to try to find Judd so that they can in turn find Jacqueline, convince her to confess to the police and stand trial. Jason tracks Judd down and explains the situation, and Judd consents to giving up Jacqueline's location. He takes them to a cheaper rented flat where he has been keeping Jacqueline since Ward's investigators discovered the previous location. Together, they go back to Jason's apartment where she reveals her side of the story. She had taken an interest in the Pilatus movement through Ms. Reddy, but when she grew unhappy with them, she revealed them to Dr. Judd. This angered them, and since the group's protocols strictly forbid acts of physical violence, they locked her up in a room in La Sagesse in order to slowly compel her to commit suicide. After months of isolation, she slowly suffered a mental breakdown, and when she saw Irving August, assuming him to be a member of the Pilatus, she killed him in order to escape. Mary takes Jacqueline back to her room at the Dante, confident that they will finally get some closure after their horrible experience. The next morning, however, while Mary is busy teaching, she gets a call from the landlord claiming that Jacqueline has left in the company of two strange men. The Pilatus, it turns out, have taken Jacqueline back to their meeting place, where they intend to pressure her into drinking from a poisoned glass to take her own life. At the last second, just as Jacqueline is about to drink, however, Frances slaps the glass out of her hand and breaks down sobbing. Jacqueline is allowed to leave of her own volition, but with the threat that she's still not safe. Jacqueline makes a long trip back to the Dante in a state of dreadful unease. She passes by a flat where a strange man looks at her lasciviously, and though she tries to get away from him, she is ultimately caught by him in an alley where he takes out a switchblade knife. She manages to get away and make it back to the Dante, where she encounters a sickly, depressed woman named Mimi, played by Elizabeth Russell. Now, Elizabeth Russell, you'll recognize as being the woman from Cat People. She's the one in the Bavarian restaurant who says my sister," to Simone's character.
Right.
It turns out that Mimi is less sick in body than she is sick in the mind and heart. Unlike Jacqueline, however, she has gotten up that evening with a renewed motivation to live, to go out and have a good time. Mimi goes back into her apartment, whereas Jacqueline enters her own, the chair and noose waiting for her. Jason and Judd are too late in reaching the Pilatus to meet Jacqueline, but before leaving, make sure to shame them for their actions, even quoting the Lord's Prayer at them, particularly the part about forgiving those who trespass against you and the part about not being led into temptation. Apparently, in the original version of the movie, like, they went through the entire prayer, so it's not so much that 4 key scenes were cut out, like some scenes were just abbreviated altogether, including that one, which I think was a good call because that would have been interminable.
Right.
In the meantime, Mary and Gregory wait in Jason's apartment for some news of Jacqueline and finally confess their love for one another. Unbeknownst to either of them, Mimi, dressed to the nines, steps out of her apartment ready to make good on her promise to herself. As she passes by the door to Jacqueline's room, we hear the chair tip over. Mimi pauses only slightly, but descends the stairs out of the apartments, and as she goes, we hear Jacqueline deliver a final narration, a quote from the 15th century poet John Donne's Holy Sonnets that we previously saw on the stained glass windows of Mary's boarding school.
I run to death, and death meets me as fast. And all my pleasures are like yesterday.
There seems to be like a theme of Lewton's movies about it concluding with some sort of epigram. We saw it in I Walked with a Zombie with the narration. In The Leopard Man, we saw it with, that dumb Paul Manning's dumb thing about how, like we're being bounced like balls on top of a fountain or whatever, like we're just adrift in life. So we see lots of patterns emerging and re-emerging through his films.
Yeah, and they're good.
Yeah.
They're a good pattern, and they serve as a prologue and an epilogue, right? So, they're really, and if you don't pay attention to those things, then you don't miss it because you see it at the end. But it's very interesting that if you don't pay attention, it's an aha moment, and there are a lot of little touches like that in this picture that and I just think that it's really like a remarkable film. I thought it was very well done. And the acting could have been a little better. I think to choose Hugh Beaumont as the possible suitor for Jacqueline before she became mentally unstable.
Yeah, I don't see here's the
There's
thing.
no real attachment.
Well, let me try to frame it in terms of the archetype of my day. In my day, Jacqueline would be like a goth alternative chick.
Right.
She would not be with a guy like Gregory Ward for any reason. It doesn't matter. The sex, the money, she wouldn't be with him.
Right.
She might be with a guy like Louis Judd. She might absolutely be with a kind of Byronic guy the type of person who says that he doesn't treat like alcoholism because he finds it sordid or something like that. Immediately upon like the test screenings of the film in its longer version, and then when it was finally released, critics basically and audiences alike were like, they just came out of the movie confused because it does have. Look, you may say now that it's not very confusing, but I think we can at least admit that there's a lot of complexities in the plot in terms of characters not revealing their true motivations, of us learning not till very late in at any narrative beat in the story of who's doing what. Really, you have 2 parallel mysteries that occur in the film, because one is the disappearance of Jacqueline, and then right in the first 10 minutes or so, we also get the death of Irving August. So now you've got 2 parallel mysteries that are both intertwined, and different bits of evidence point to different bits of the mystery. So that element can be confusing. And I guess one of the best, digs against the film was by Bosley Carruthers from the New York Times, where he said, the movie might make more sense if it were projected backwards, which, as a fan of The Seventh Victim, I don't respect as an assessment of its plot, but as a film critic, I do respect as an excellent dig. Like, that was a well-made shot fired.
Well, I mean, going backwards or forward, as long as if you get some of the meaning out of it, I mean,
Right.
And the other thing is that I think, like I said, the script is not as tight, and so
Right.
the motivations, like
It's a little convoluted.
You mentioned
Yeah.
that, but the motivations of people isn't quite clear.
Right,
It's not
that's
quite
it.
clear whether Tom Conway is a good guy or bad guy, and his portrayal of Louis Judd is the same in every movie. I mean,
And you
you
know
could pick him up and put him to every movie, and there's no show of emotion. It's all this high intellectual kind of approach to things that's somewhat unnerving, but I guess it's all right. I mean, the idea is there's no real...
The same with the Paul Hogue character. It's not like it and I think that's
Who's that? Oh, Jason
the
Hogue?
poet character.
Jason Hogue.
The forgettable poet character who I'm really not sure needs to be there.
Yeah, what is he
Or
there?
if
To
he
make
is-
people laugh?
Or if he or if he is there, he should be combined with the Gregory Ward character. It should be like someone that we could imagine Jacqueline falling in love with, a handsome businessman who deep down is hiding the heart of a poet. That would also make more sense that Kim Hunter's character Mary falls in love with him, because you could have great scenes of him like sort of... Here they do this weird thing during the climax that I didn't even mention in the plot synopsis because it was just going to convolute things further. Like, there's this whole thing going on where, number one, there's like this rivalry between Paul and Dr. Louis Judd, because Paul feels like Louis Judd stole his past girlfriend, but then Judd reveals that he actually once really respected Paul. Jason, yeah. He once really respected him, but he
lost
But he lost respect for him once he gave up on his writing, and so like he's actually been mean to him to try to push him to pursue writing again, and then he reveals that the girl was actually in an asylum, and he just didn't have the heart to tell him or some crap like that.
Well, there's also HIPAA, but it didn't exist back then.
Right.
But
then of course there's the whole thing where Paul the poet character, or Jason the poet character, he has this whole thing where he's like the Cyrano, where he plays the guy who is getting Mary and Gregory to finally admit to each other that they love each other, because he's also in love with Mary, and so he feels like he needs to do it. And I'm sitting here thinking this adds nothing to the story. It's melodramatically trite.
Well, I think it's good because then it goes to show that even though it wasn't apparent to me that Hugh Beaumont actually had affections for Kim Hunter. I mean, it wasn't clear, so I'm glad he stated it.
Right.
But it was so rushed. You didn't. Oh, we were both in love with the same woman. I mean, so there are.
Yeah, I think there's this weird thing where like and that's the thing, and that's where it becomes trite, because it ends up being a thing where it seems like every significant male character just has a habit of falling in love with exactly the same woman. There are no other women in New York City. None of them except Dr. Louis Judd seems to be in the spirit that like there's a million naked ladies in the city. That one was only one of them.
Right.
But like And that's the thing that really pins it down, is that the sort of conventional take about The Seventh Victim, I think, before people really started being honest about the kind of flaws of the film, despite how aesthetically successful it is. It's very good at evoking a mood and getting you in this kind of oppressive feeling of inescapability. And it culminates in one of the most tragic sequences that's ever been committed to a movie. Whether you want to call it a horror movie or a noir movie, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But there's this thing where the convention was that, and this has been promoted by a lot of people who worked with Val Lewton or Val Lewton's son, Val Edwin Lewton, this idea that the movie was a victim of bureaucratic meddling, that in its longer original cut, it made more sense, but then it was cut because of the studio mandates of the running time, and now it became confusing. I think you're right that the real issue, and it becomes abundantly clear when you watch the movie, is that the movie is not a victim of bureaucratic meddling. In fact, in this case, it seems like bureaucratic meddling might have led to them actually economizing a already convoluted plot to make it less confusing for the spectator and more effective as a simple, straightforward thriller. The real problem is fundamentally the one where Lewton was working in a incredibly stressful, like factory line B film producing process where his productions were constantly overlapping, and they had to rush the script of The Seventh Victim together, and as an inevitable component of it, there are just some things about the story that just don't make any sense.
Right. Well, they make sense, but they're just so rushed that you really don't have any emotional feeling attached to it.
Well, here there are definitely things that just don't make any sense, and you're right. It's not the literal elements of the plot; those are discernible in the same way that if you watch like The Big Sleep. The Big Sleep is a hella confusing movie the first time you watch it. A lot of early noir movies were like that because they were adapted or inspired by literary sources that traded a lot on that very theme of like the story is convoluted because it reflects the complexity of an actual criminal investigation. It reflects the complexity of how do you determine that someone is an honest actor or what their real motivations are, and how does that affect the pursuit of justice or trying to restore order in the world. So these movies are confusing, but if you watch them enough, everything sort of comes together. The definite problem with The Seventh Victim is that it's a movie that was rushed to an extent, and the people behind it had a sort of unrealistic aspiration of how sort of literary and sort of like allegorical they wanted it to be. And as a result, you get things like the fact that the characterization of Louis Judd himself and why it consistently doesn't work throughout the film, and why in a certain context it can be quite confusing for a spectator. Because the first time we meet Judd, he's very suave and very confident. But the filmmakers do something very clever, which is that they go back to the apartment where he's keeping Jacqueline. It's a very simple scenario. He's been having an affair with Jacqueline that has started since he began treating her as his patient, and now he's just keeping her as a mistress. You know, that you have that whole element where he's very calmly and coolly asking Jacqueline's literal husband for money so that he can support her, or that she can support her.
I don't get that at all.
Right. Well, that's another thing that's sort of unclear and confusing. Is just
I don't
like,
get that.
You know,
I get him as being, I don't know what he is, what his motivation is. It seems like his motivation was to actually dissect out the Pilotists and get to the root of them, and to do them in. And it's kind of funny. That's what it looks like, and he's trying to be surreptitious about it so that he doesn't give away leads that would tip them off.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Yeah. But that's the thing, though, is that like Conway clearly isn't conveying consistent motivation, and this might even be a part of like Mark Robeson's limitations as a first time director.
It's Tom Conway's acting. Like I said, every film there's no motivation.
But you have script supervisors, you have a director, you have a acting coach.
I get it. Yeah.
You have people who are supposed to be there on set to clarify what the continuity of your motivation is supposed to be in the story. So Tom Conway goes from being this guy who you have this great setup where he's suave and cool and collected, and then they go back to the apartment. He realizes Jacqueline isn't there, and suddenly he's terrified. Suddenly he's like, I have to get out of here, because he's like, oh my God, she went to see them on her own. He's clearly terrified in that scene of the Pilatus and what they can do.
To him or to her?
Well, it's not clear. And then later on, when Jason leads them to the Pilatus little hangout, there Paul Judd is just sort of hanging out with them. And that completely conflicts with the notion that he's supposed to be a guy who is afraid for Jacqueline's life because she revealed secret information about their cult to him. Because, and that's the thing, is that they're setting up this they set up this ambiguity that doesn't pay off, because at first,
no, now that you mention it to me, it does pay off, because now I'm even more enthralled with the whole thing. It sounds perfectly logical that he was having an affair, but as she became more demented, he was just keeping her for protection, just to protect her. Like he was done with her already.
Right, but
he's ready to move on to another woman.
But why is he hanging out with these Satanists who like have a pact of killing killing the person who reveals themselves?
Well,
about
they don't
this
kill;
society?
they have to do by suicide, which is interesting. I want to get on that topic because you missed a point. The point is that who's the guy who's the head Pilatus there? Oh yeah, we'll let you go, but at some point you have to take your life. Wink, wink. Go to the guy with the switchblade and send him.
Well, see, that's another disagreement that we have over the interpretation of the film. But Dad, here's the thing: is that like they're clearly setting up an ambiguity in that scene where you're supposed to think that Judd is a part of this organization, not that he is just some guy who is only knows about it through Jacqueline. That's the fundamental issue. You set up an ambiguity about Paul Judd's character that is then washed away with this trite thing where he finds out that she killed Irving August, and we have this whole thing where it's like, I was just trying to encourage you as a poet, I was trying to protect you. It's just like there's an inconsistency between the guy who is so cool and collected and seems to be so much a part of the kind of Byronic world of these literal devil worshippers, he's even playing a card trick with them. If you notice, he's playing, now it's a card counting trick and he knows it, but it's one of those card counting tricks where you have people pick a card and then you pick the card out of the deck that they picked. Really, it's just a card counting trick, but he tells them, no, this is all a matter of the mind. This is about me. Now, he means this is about me tricking you into thinking I have some third sight. But what he means to them is that I have a third sight. That's what he wants them to believe. But so you already have this scenario of him that associates him so much with this occult world. And then it just doesn't gel with the guy who was so terrified at the fact that Jacqueline was going to see these people on her own.
Right.
The time period of the movie is also off because 8 months ago, Jacqueline is forced to sell her business to Esther Reddy, or she just gives the business to Esther Reddy. And then 6 months ago, she stops paying for the tuition of her sister. So I guess we can assume there's some connection between her not having an income and not being able to pay for her sister's education. But then how long was she seeing Dr. Judd?
6 months.
And well, no, because that doesn't make sense, because in those 6 months, she's been locked in the room in La Sagesse. Because that's the whole point. That's the other thing. We don't know how long she's been in solitary.
Well, you remember there's a statement where he says, why'd you, I forget who questions him about it. What about that room you keep her in? Why is there a noose there? Right? They break into the room and they see the noose. I guess Hugh Beaumont is the one, I forget who does, whether it's Jason Hope.
Right. Yeah.
And he reveals, I did that because she found it more peaceful.
It's part of her treatment. He helped her make it.
Right, and he says, I don't figure her for committing suicide. So I thought it'd be part. There's something about the whole thing that's very sordid, right? And I agree with you.
He just like that whole, and I guess, and those parts are intentional because he's confident she wouldn't commit suicide, because Gregory Ward, the attorney character, he's the one who helps set up the room. He's confident she won't commit suicide. But apparently her just giving away her business isn't a telltale sign of somebody who's about to take their own life.
Right,
like any psychologist will tell you that.
Right.
And and that's, but then again, like the lines aren't matching up. So it's like, when does she start? Because the amount of time in which everyone is losing contact with Jacqueline, but Frances, when she meets Mary again, Frances and Mary know each other somehow. So maybe Mary grew up in New York, or are they from the same place? That's not clear. And then Frances says, "Oh, I just saw Jacqueline last week." And it's like, okay, so you saw Jacqueline last week, so has she only been in that room in La Sagesse for a week? Like, where is everything supposed to be falling? So why did she give the company to Esther Reddy 8 months ago? Is it because that was when she started seeing Judd? That's when she started telling him about their satanic associations.
Yeah.
So she decided she wanted to get out of the
Well,
situation.
Fallon was part of the group too.
Right.
Because the head lady says, that's us. That symbol is us, you moron. You told.
And Fallon is sort of painted as a person who's just literally too ignorant. She's just going along because she thinks the organization is cool. She doesn't really take it very seriously. It's not clear. It's just there's a lot of stuff that is done purely for atmospheric purposes that, again, just doesn't have a narrative payoff. And again, contributes to a legitimate sense of confusion about what we're supposed to be focusing on. What is the point of this? Like, why have this whole Cyrano thing? Why not just make the poet and the attorney one character? Wouldn't that make more sense?
Who likes the spotlight and says it's Cyrano's blade or something?
Right, exactly. You already have two characters who have a romantic rivalry between each other. Don't introduce another character who's going to have a romantic rivalry with both of those characters. It's just not going to work.
Anyway.
But that being said, like, I do think, and that's, so, like, let's get to that part of the climax. You think that, like, that knife-wielding guy is connected to the Pilatus.
Yes.
I think that's the point in the movie, and that is illustrating Jacqueline's descent into a total mental breakdown.
No, I don't think so, because he looks to someone over to the side. It's one of the guys. When the guy says, "You go ahead, go back to your room. We're not going to," but and he looks over to the side, and I think it's the guy, and the guy follows her. No, I think...
No.
I think this guy wants to... The guy who's the head Pilatist says they're because there's going to frighten everybody away thinking they're murderers. He wants the people to think, but there's always an out. And so even when you get these groups like that, there's always an out. You always have a cleaner somewhere that you can, tap into and say, okay, you go and finish her off. That's what I feel.
I'm going to have to rewatch it because I don't remember that specific shot.
Yep.
But I will say this. I think it's very telling the way they set it up, because the first thing that happens is that she sees a man and a woman standing on the corner. It's obviously supposed to be a John trying to procure, like, a woman of the evening. Of course, no one says that explicitly because this is the 1940s. We can't even talk about that stuff.
New
but she sees that.
Devout Methodist.
So but she sees that, and she runs away terrified because she's just not sure if she can trust anybody. Then
and she's so tired. I get your point.
Then she sees the guy coming out of the apartment who gives her this lascivious look, and she runs away, and he does chase after her. But that's the question of, well, is this just like a cat chaser? Is this guy just like, just a masher?
Right, and he doesn't kill her because what happens?
And then
the minstrel group comes out and he can't kill her in broad daylight now.
And then we don't see him for the rest of the sequence. She goes into this alley. She's in front of a doorway to a small burlesque theater that literally has a depiction of the tragedy and the comedy symbols, and in the background people are laughing at her. So is this a cosmic joke? Is any of this real? Is she?
I don't think it's that layered.
Did the Pilatus achieve what they? Because that's the thing. The Pilatus have a invocation against using violence. They're just trying to get her to kill herself. So I'm wondering are they finally successful? Do they really
she commits suicide.
Right, they push her over the edge, and so I'm wondering, when she's in that alley, she feels someone touching her, she sees the man with the knife, and then as soon as the doors open to the theater, the guy is blinded and turns away. Then she runs over to them, and we never see this guy again.
No.
I'm wondering if he's like the ultimate figment of her imagination. No, I
don't think so. I think
it becomes the theme of, is she brave enough to live in the world? Is she brave enough to do what Mary has decided to do and not go back to this cloister which she imagines is going to protect her from all of her pathological fears? And I think that's the fascinating thing about the movie, is that ultimately that's part of the reason why it is so disappointing from a narrative perspective, and why it is unnecessarily convoluted. Because ultimately this is a movie, just like Cat People, about the sort of something that we don't see represented a lot in American movies, period, especially not movies from this period, which is the idea of people who don't think life is worth living.
Right.
That
right.
It's too terrifying, it's too alienating, it's too demanding. Jacqueline was apparently very successful, but then she just reached a point where whatever sort of, whether it was sex or whether it was these sort of esoteric dalliances, the sort of coping mechanisms that she had been using to ignore her problems stopped working. And now we meet her at a point in her life where she's literally been driven mad with isolation. And that introduces questions about Judd's character as like a psychiatrist, because obviously don't get in a relationship with your patients.
Right.
But like, it's like, also don't, like, I think it's a bad idea if you as a psychiatrist decide, I'm going to literally isolate you from the people you love. Like, it's just like, like there's all sorts of stuff that doesn't quite work, but underneath all of it, and the thing that aesthetically it does really well, is convey that sort of sense of like, is this the message of Lewton's movies? Is death sometimes good? Is this the, are we too...
Well, it's complicated. It also puts Judd on the mark because of the fact of his disparaging comments about alcoholics.
Right.
And saying it's not worth. I don't do it anymore because it's not worth my time.
Yeah, there's.
I mean, it's really amazing. See, he kind of rubs his eye bridge, and says, I really can't.
He's a physician who doesn't seem terribly concerned about helping.
It looks like he's been using people. And you're right. There seems to be an ulterior motive in him, and I don't know.
Well, luckily we know that later on he tries to do the same thing with another depressive case and gets killed by a cat monster.
Right.
So there's that thing to worry about. There's that thing to go out on. Like, I think it's a good idea.
All right.
Before we go out, I did want to tell you something that I discover. Where do you think the inspiration came for the Pilotists? Did you assume that they were a fictitious group?
No, I did not. But I didn't bother looking them up.
Okay. Okay. So here's the. So tell me if you believe me or not. The Pilotists were a 19th century group of theistic Satanists. They were a sect within the Freemasons who engaged in really violent acts of ritual abuse and sacrifice, and there are even allegations that they literally could conjure spirits and like dance with the devil and stuff like that.
It's like religion.
Right. Yeah. Can you believe that?
No, I do believe it. I mean, yes.
Well, you shouldn't believe it because it's bullshit. Okay, so
it's not true.
No, the Pilotists. The first reference to the Pilotists comes from a late 19th century French writer and satirist named Leo Taxil. Now, Taxil invented the Pilotists as part of an elaborate hoax in order to make a mockery of the Catholic Church and the fanatical beliefs it promoted about secret societies like the Freemasons. So he was basically making, in his writings and in his public speaking, these increasingly outlandish and completely unsubstantiated claims about these secret devil worshippers among the Freemasons. And he was just trying to see how far he would go and people would still believe him. And more importantly, that he would still have his beliefs being promoted by clergy in the Catholic Church. Ultimately, Taxil kept up this hoax for 7 years before he finally revealed that he made the whole thing up at a press conference of the Geographic Society of Paris. And in that speech where he confessed that he made it all up, he specifically thanked the Catholic Church for helping to promote his writings because it also made him a good amount of money being able to publish all of this BS. And so here's the interesting thing. Despite the fact that Taxil made his writings as a joke in order to specifically mock how credulous people were to completely outlandish and baseless claims, particularly as it regards this idea that within Christian society, within conservative society, he's criticizing and satirizing this almost collective pathological belief of there being like these secret nefarious organizations that seemingly for no reason whatsoever are just like, you know, sacrificing children and conjuring the devil and having orgies and doing all
Sounds
these.
familiar.
Yeah, does it sound familiar? It does sound familiar. And here's the thing. Taxel's writings, despite the fact that they were satiric, keep getting unironically cited by writers to this day who are also writing now non-satirically about secret satanic cults. One of the most important citations comes from James Randall Noblitt and Pamela Sue Perkins' 1995 book, Cult and Ritual Abuse. And this is a seminal work of late 20th century satanic panic. This book that is promoting the idea that there's these widespread clandestine societies in all over middle America that are practicing satanic ritual abuse. Now, so here's the question I have. Did Lewton believe, like Taxel intended in his satire, that the Pilotists were a real organization? Or was he or his writers aware of the fact that the Pilotists were a hoax, and the joke is supposed to be a kind of inside joke at the expense of the satanic socialites in the movie? The idea being basically that Esther Reddy just picked up a random book from the library and took a name and a symbol that were completely made up. And now she and her friends are like parading around saying that, oh, we're Satanists. So like, I just think that's interesting because it does add another sort of, again, at a metatextual level, that idea of what's the line between the real and the unreal, what we perceive and what we can actually say is an objective reality, or what can the mind make real? All these, I just thought that was a very interesting coda to this whole story about satanic ritual abuse and trying to get people to kill themselves. I think that's going to do it for today's episode. If you are not a patron of Monster Craze Memoirs, literally for $1 a month will get you a bunch of bonus content, which means that next week you'll be getting a episode that's exclusive to patrons. We'll be coming back with another Val Lewton film. This one got a even more unceremonious fate than The Seventh Victim, because unfortunately The Seventh Victim, I had told Rocco about this before and I sort of forgot to mention it. The coda of The Seventh Victim is that not only did Lewton not get to produce it as an A picture, not only did it get cut by the studio, but basically RKO just refused to do publicity for the film.
Right. But you did, yeah, right.
And so basically, now that may sound a little cruel to everybody, but I'm going to put it this way. And this is not me heaping dirt on Lewton's grave. This is just me saying that Lewton had already established by that point a clear pattern of not effectively being able to gel with the ideas of the executives about what they wanted out of the horror movies they were producing. He would take their titles that were clearly meant to suggest something that's more lurid and populist, and he would make these literary, cerebral, philosophical, adult-oriented movies that, while they may have been better movies, they were also much worse gambles at the box office. Now, that's actually very important because, The Seventh Victim is primed to come out at the end of summer of 1943. Now, the problem is that what's also happening is that the economic prospects of The Seventh Victim being released in August are already under threat, because guess who is RKO's main competitor in the horror market? It's Universal. So Universal is planning on releasing a lavish color remake of Phantom of the Opera. So given the choice, if you're going to see a horror movie at the end of August, are you going to see this small B programmer that contains no-name stars and doesn't seem to have a marquee monster in it, is black and white, people are coming out of it, word of mouth says it's confusing? or are you going to see the Phantom of the Opera? Lavish, color, big name star, all that jazz. Of course, you're going to see Phantom of the Opera. So they considered delaying the release for Halloween, but then what also happens? Damn it, there's also competition from another Universal horror film, which is an anthology film called Flesh and Fantasy. So ultimately, RKO just decides that they have no faith in the product. They release it without publicity. It proves to be the worst performing of all of Lewton's films up to that date. And I think it's the worst performing film that he ever has. When we're going to come back, we're going to be exploring a film where the situation actually turned out to be kind of worse than the seventh victim. And again, this is what I meant at the end of the Leopard Man episode, which you would be able to hear if you were a patron of the podcast. That's from last week. This is part of the very quick downward turn in Lewton's career, despite the fact that his first two movies made so much money. But we'll get into it when we come back with the Ghost Ship next week, because despite the fact that the Ghost Ship really had a kind of an ill fate of its own, I think it's a really stupendous picture, and I'm really eager to see what Dad's opinions are of it. But again, you're not going to be able to hear it if you're just a free listener. Subscribe to the podcast, like and rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you become a subscriber, literally just $1 a month, you'll get all sorts of bonus content. Otherwise, thank you for joining us here on Monster Craze Memoirs. We will catch you next time for the next episode in the very sad saga of Valerie Lewton.